welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome back to Turn the Page. I am Lisa, here with Stacy and author Ann Leary. And Ann has a book coming out on May 31st called The Foundling. And I will just let her say a little bit about the book now and, just give us a little background on it. Okay, the floor is yours, Ann.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, well, thank you for having me on your podcast. My new book is a novel. It's called The Foundling, and it's my fourth novel, but it's my first historical fiction work, I would say. I didn't set out to write this book. I was doing family. I got really caught up in the genealogy, ancestry craze about a decade ago. I was finishing another novel. And all I really wanted to know was how my grandmother became an orphan. I never knew why she grew up in an orphanage, what happened to her mother. I still don't know the answer to that. But what I did find was the first record I could find of my grandmother, whose name was Mary Rauschmeyer. In 1930, she was employed at a place called the Laurelton State Village for Feebleminded Women of childbearing age. And that was in Pennsylvania. My grandmother was a stenographer, and she was 17 years old. And I thought, okay, that's not a very, the longest, most off-putting name of a place I've ever seen. So I had, of course, to find out all about it. I found out that feeble-minded was in those days not, well, it wasn't really a slur. It was actually a clinical term, as were the words moron and imbecile and idiot. Those were actually the way they classified levels of intellectual disabilities. The part I thought was the most offensive was this feeble-minded business. But what I found out was the part that was the most shocking was the of childbearing age part of the name of the place. Because what I found out was Laurelton State Village, at that time, it later became a different kind of place, but at that time it was founded as a eugenics asylum, and it was one of many in the United States in the early 20th century. I went down a rabbit hole of research. I was all over. I love to research. I'm super curious and I love history. So I read everything I could. And then I handed in the final draft of my last novel, got in my car, and I drove to central Pennsylvania to find out about this place. And I went to Harrisburg to look in the state archives. And then I actually went back, and I spent years researching and writing this book. I originally was going to write a nonfiction kind of book of discovery about this, about what I found out, more of a journalistic kind of endeavor. But I actually then realized I wanted to, a few characters came to me, and honestly, I didn't know my grandmother very well growing up. She was dead when I found this out about her. And according to my mother, she was my maternal grandmother. She never spoke of working there. So I really had to fill in the blanks, and I really was able to. What was fascinating, there were many fascinating things, but so many things that I found out on newspaper archives and in the records of this asylum and many other asylums. And there have been many books written about the eugenics era, even though we are not still probably taught that in our own public schools, that part of our history, which was a very big part of our American history. So I was able to fill in a lot of the blanks with things I found out about, true historic characters. And two very compelling characters came to me that were based on real characters: my grandmother and the superintendent of the asylum, whose name was Dr. Mary Wolfe, the real person. The head of the asylum in my novel is Dr. Vogel. She is loosely based on the real character. She's actually based on a few people. Margaret Sanger would be one, and a few other prominent women of that time. And then the others came to me from what I learned. I found out women were there who were certainly not intellectually disabled. It was more of a home for what they called moral defectives. They were more kind of delinquent young women. And it wasn't a training school. The whole idea of the place was to prevent the wrong types of women from having children. It was the eugenics crusade was all about kind of improving the American population, actually improving the race that was the kind of deemed the superior race at the time of American white Christians, and by preventing the wrong types from having children. And so the way they would do that is either through sterilization, which was not legal in many states, but mostly with young women it was by putting them in asylums. The truth is, this book is set in the 1920s. In the 1920s, if you were a rich young woman, you could be who I always associated with the 1920s. You could be, Zelda Fitzgerald. You could be a flapper. You could be wild and crazy. You could be Brett Ashley from, The Sun Also Rises. You could have lovers. You could be an alcoholic. If you were poor, if you were rich and those were your behaviors, you were kind of seen as eccentric and kind of fabulous. If you were poor, you were seen as a menace to society. And the best thing to do would be to lock you away and and then you would be indebted to the state or in Pennsylvania's case, the Commonwealth, for them keeping you there, and you'd have to work. You'd work in the asylum. They would farm these girls off to work in local industries and homes. So everything I learned was fascinating. Some of it was very dark. Some of it was hard to understand at first, and then it made more sense. And I'm still fascinated. I find out things every day still about the place where my grandmother worked, about other places just like it in the United States, Canada, and the UK. And our eugenics movement is what, eventually inspired the Nazis and Hitler with their Holocaust.
And I think the subject is timely now with the freedom of choice once again taking center stage. And these women had no choice when they're separated from society, specifically so they don't have children. It's a different way of control.
Absolutely. So it was absolutely about women's reproductive rights. It was sort of a different angle on it. It was literally that these women the right to be mothers was taken away from them. They didn't have that because they were deemed unfit to be mothers. They were criminality was quite linked with genetics through some kind of flawed sociology at the time, like the Kallikak and the Juke studies. But yes, so if you were a mother, your child would be taken from you, and you wouldn't be allowed. If you were sent there at 16, you had to stay till menopause. So it wasn't like a sentence for a crime. Even if you did a crime, you would stay until you could no longer have children. So yeah, it was, that was, again, women had no reproductive rights, but don't forget, in those days, women had the right to vote, but they had few other rights. They were actually, they had the legal status of children, really. Married women were considered, the kind of their husbands were their guardians. If you were a doctor or a lawyer, your husband was kind of your legal guardian. You couldn't own a bank account. And then if you were not married, your father was such. So I think that, women had fewer rights in general, but certainly did not have reproductive rights. And one more thing I found out, and which was a big theme in this book, was that you didn't need a judge or even a doctor to be sentenced to stay at a place like this. Your husband who was sick of you, your uncle who has been molesting you that you told on, anyone really, a man in the community or a woman could say that you were slow, and they would give you a very rudimentary IQ test, and you could be sentenced to decades in one of these work farms.
Yeah. I mean, you said that in the book, and I was like, yeah, I could see that being possible. So, and I think that's why I was one of the characters that was intriguing to me was Dr. Vogel, because she seemed, she came from money and she was educated and she was a doctor and she wasn't married, and she seemed so different than the other women in the book and other women in that time. And that could be one of the reasons why I felt like Mary really admired her, because she was different.
Yes, it was hard. It was hard for me. The main character, people very much, in contemporary fiction, I think we've all gotten used to female protagonists are supposed to be our heroes. They're supposed to be people we admire. But, my female narrator really is based on my grandmother. She was not she never went to college. She was very bright, but she was poor. She was an orphan. This was a great job for her. And she was 17 and she was raised by nuns. So she wouldn't have, and eugenics was the law of the land. It was not seen as, it was all, very, it was nothing, it wasn't a secret place. This was very well respected place. So she would have been probably in awe of a Dr. Vogel. The woman she worked for was quite like her. She was the Dr. Vogel in my novel is in her 40s. She's never married. She came from a wealthy family. And she went to medical school and graduated in, right at the turn of the century. Yet if she had married, again, she would have had the legal status of a child. Her father was dead. So she actually did have more kind of agency than most women of her time. And she was a psychiatrist, and she decided to be the, she was chosen to be the superintendent of this new asylum. She had been at a big state psychiatric hospital, and then she started this. It was a eugenics asylum, and there was no trying to. Of course, there was nothing. They weren't trying to hide that people wanted these places. So it was specifically, as I said, it was a holding pen. It wasn't a place you went to get training or to get well, because there was no. You weren't really sick. You were just genetically inferior to the rest of the people in the community, either through your behavior or in some cases where my grandmother worked, there were some people who truly did have intellectual disabilities, but it seemed that was a very small percentage in the early years.
And, I feel like Mary came from a very awful family situation between her parents, her uncle, and even her aunt, who was just like, when she left, she was just like, well, you're not coming back,
Yeah.
I feel like she was either unwanted or taken advantage of by adults. And I think in this way, it made her like more sympathetic to the other girls that were there. It just seemed like, she had the same kind of background as a lot of them. But, I think she, at first she was thinking it was the right thing to do, but then, especially when she, we haven't really talked that much about, Lillian.
Yeah.
But I think when she found that there were no test results for Lillian, that's when I think the doubt kind of like set.
Right. Yeah. So the big part of the plot is she arrives at this place, which is, she had grown up in Scranton, and this institution is in the middle of Pennsylvania, and she loves it. It's beautiful. And the real place that existed, it was a beautiful facility.
It was just sold.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
She's free, she's free of the aunt, she's free of the nuns, she has friends, she's got this wild friend who's a nurse, who's kind of a flapper, fun girl. She starts dating and she loves it. And she's very much in awe of her boss, Dr. Vogel. And but very soon after she arrives, she is in the dining hall where the staff dine, and also what they called inmates in those days. They weren't called residents, they were called inmates. One of them who she recognizes is actually a childhood friend from the orphanage where she grew up. In those days, they called orphanages orphan asylums. It was so hard getting used to some of the words seemed so harsh, and they weren't. That's just the words they used at the time. So my grandmother and most orphans were also called inmates in orphan asylums. It didn't mean they were prisoners, but anyway. She sees Lillian. She doesn't understand why she's there. She doesn't remember Lillian having any kind of disability intellectually, but she hasn't seen her in a while, and she's told, that the staff isn't allowed to, stay on if they have friends that are inmates there. And anyway, so that's kind of the problem she encounters very early on is, why is Lillian here? And when she talks to Lillian and finds out why she's there, it's very upsetting. But Lillian also seems a little bit, she seems unstable. And Mary remembers she was also quite impulsive, and she's learned a lot of what they called morally defective behavior. So she's sort of been brain, she's drank the Kool-Aid of the eugenics movement about what makes a person morally or mentally inferior. And she thinks maybe Lillian is that. And so, ultimately she has to decide is, who's right? Who do I trust? This amazing doctor who's taken me under her wing and who wants to, help me, has offered to help me through college, or this kind of troubled friend from childhood. So that's the quandary.
And I loved the twist to the ending, which obviously I'm not going to ruin.
Spoilers.
I don't want to spoil it.
No spoilers. I meant no spoilers. No, it sounds fascinating. Like I was a history major and I took a lot of American history classes. So, but you're spot on the mark when you say like we don't really learn about the movement in America. It's briefly touched upon. Like I didn't really learn it until I was in college.
Yes, I learned it when my daughter was in college and she was in a women's studies class and writing a paper on eugenics. And I know a lot of people my age, we really weren't taught that. Now in the United Kingdom and Canada, they're taught it in public schools when they learn about the Holocaust. It really was a major movement. It was short-lived. So, kind of the war came and people saw where this movement ends up, and nobody really wanted that. But at the time, it seemed like it was social Darwinism. Basically, it made sense. It seemed very progressive. It seemed very scientific, and I really then studied Margaret Sanger. She's been somebody who has been, and again, this is very much in the news right now, is the reproductive rights, and people have been this kind of, she was sainted and then she was vilified. And the truth is, and this really helped me with the Dr. Vogel character, you can't judge these women by by the standards of our time. Margaret Sanger, again, she could vote and she worked hard, she rallied with the other women for the right to vote, but she didn't, her husband managed their money. If she got a divorce, she wouldn't be able to keep her kids. She didn't have many rights, but she was a nurse and she took care of women in tenements. And she saw what happened when women don't have the right to have access to birth control and knowledge about birth control that wealthy women had. They knew, the educated women knew how to prevent births. And if they got pregnant, they could have access to, what was then, sometimes a healthy, much safer abortion than poor women had. So what she did was amazing, she was also, though, a eugenics, very strong eugenics proponent. But it was, I can't really apologize for that for her. She, if it weren't for, I read recently, somebody wrote, if it weren't for the eugenics movement, there'd be no Planned Parenthood. We love Planned Parenthood. And so we have to I think we have to get to a place. And I don't know if it's an American thing or just a human thing where, heroes have to be heroes and villains have to be villains. And there's no way that a person can be, a kind of a multifaceted person who has done great things and who had kind of flawed thinking or flawed by today's standards, kind of ideologies.
Yeah, that's true. It's like there's no gray. It's like either black or white. It's like
and there is gray. And so I just, that was really a struggle. I wanted people to buy this book, and I couldn't, I realized it seems like a dark subject, it's set in an asylum, but it's set in the 20s. It's the jazz era. It's my favorite era. And there's a very much, a large part of the book is Mary, the main character, having fun, going to speakeasies, as everybody did, going out to, dance. And also, Lillian, the reason she's there is she was a very talented singer, and she had a baby that was with the man she wasn't married to. When the baby was born, he was obviously of mixed race. The man she was in love with was a Black musician. And that immediately qualified her as feeble-minded, because she was, if you had, in those days, if you were a Caucasian woman and had sex with a Black man, and again, if you were poor, something was considered wrong with, you were just automatically feeble-minded. And so the baby was taken from her, and she was sent to this place again until her menopause. She was 20 when she went there.
It's interesting you say that about pointing out the fact that it was because if you were a poor woman and did that, because I'm just reminded of, I love Downton Abbey, so excited for the movie, but there's a character, Rose, and she's wealthy to do, related to the family, and she kind of has a brief love affair with a Black man.
Yeah.
It's frowned upon, but it's just like, oh, okay, she'll get it out of her system type thing.
Yes, I mean, there was Cafe Society in Paris and Berlin, of course, before the war. There were people with very, very, if you could be kind of a member of this kind of avant-garde artistic community that were very, well-heeled. They were, the writers and artists, and, every behavior that might get you put in a eugenics asylum if you didn't have family or money, you could kind of do. It was considered, quite, none of it was considered eccentric, but it wouldn't get you, necessarily locked up unless your family was very conservative, and then they'd put you probably in a private hospital. But it just it's very, very hard reading the names of the inmates, as they were called, in the census records. The census records, if anyone is into genealogy, they come out every 10 years. And so I was, my grandmother was in the 1930 records, and then I would see these girls, some of them, their mothers tried to get them out. They would try to do habeas corpus cases. She's not feeble-minded. She just, she was a prostitute when she was 18, as many poor girls were, in, kind of in the industrial kind of revolution in these industrial times. Anyway, some of these mothers tried to get the girls out, and there were articles in the newspaper, and they always lost. And then I would look, and every decade they'd still be there. So like the mom would try, one of them, the mother tried to get the girl out, and she was 18. And then the next census, she was 28, and then she was 38. It was hard to think of, the prom, these women were, they were denied everything. They had everything was taken. Their life was taken from them, their freedom. They could never have, they had no freedom that our Constitution, is supposed to, guarantee all Americans. They were denied that.
Yeah. I also want to say, this is very exciting, but you got a starred review from Kirkus.
Yeah.
And in the library world, it is very hard to get a starred review. They said, Leary's wit complements her serious approach to historical and psychological issues in this thoroughly satisfying novel. To them, that is high praise. So as library people, we are very excited when we see something.
Yeah, I was so happy. And everyone, the Kirkus and Publishers Weekly are the kind of the early, the two of the, pre-publication reviews. Then, I've been working on this for 6 years. I had no idea if people would get it or like it or hate it or be offended by it. And so I really was satisfying that they did get it. And I like that they mentioned the wit, it is a dark topic, but I liked, I feel like my grandmother had a sense of humor, I'm told. And I feel that, I had to have some there's these people are in their 20s. There's fun. They have fun. Young women together always have fun in my experience. Unless they're locked in an asylum. Even then, I think even then you see scenes where it's a little orange is black. You see a little bit of the interaction between the inmates, and you kind of feel like at least they have each other.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us. And I am very excited to get this book in the hands of my patrons here at the library. I'll be highly recommending it.
I really appreciate it. And I'm so pleased that you have this podcast. Do a lot of libraries have podcasts now, or?
They're becoming a lot more popular.
Uh-huh.
But
It's fabulous.
Where we started it like years ago.
A couple of years ago, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
And then did it become big during COVID? Was it big? Yeah.
It definitely got bigger during COVID, since a lot of authors, like usually at the library, we have like author visits in person where like, the author will come talk about their book, do a Q&A, sell their book. And, with COVID, people weren't traveling. So it became a lot of like, oh, we could do virtual programming. And it was just like, oh yeah, like I'd love to talk about my book. I love doing these because I love, coming across like books that I might not have necessarily like went after, but I have to say I'm very excited for your book because it's right up my alley.
Oh, good. I feel again, this is my first, the book isn't coming out for 3 weeks. This is my first kind of book.
What I loved about it is I love historical fiction and I love like psychological suspense. And I think it mixes both the genres a little bit. I mean, obviously it's more historical, but the fact is you want to know about this whole Lillian thing. It's like on the edge of your seat. You just like kind of can't.
Yes.
So I love the fact that there's both things in there.
Well, there's nothing in this book. This is a novel. So it's really, there's nothing, none of the people, and I do an author's note at the beginning, the kind of, this is not, this is based on all these characters are from my imagination, but there's nothing in the pages of this novel that is that I didn't go, that didn't happen just, in a one form or another, at the asylum where my grandmother worked, or others I read about. So I made up you see what I'm saying? Like the plot is fiction, yes. But I certainly didn't, it really, that, the things that happened there were real.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.